Christians, good evening. Hope you're having a good Monday night. I trust that your day went well. I'm going to get into the book of Galatians, continuing the series on Galatians chapter 5, the exposition. And we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered a lot of ground over time, and it has been a very productive discussion that we've been having. And what I intend to do tonight is to continue with the theme on the works of the flesh. The works of the flesh. Now, Paul lists these works out in Galatians 5 and admonishes us that those who practice these works of the flesh are not to inherit the kingdom of God, which means this is something of significance in terms of demanding our attention. Now, in Galatians, just by way of a brief review, Paul has been dealing with the Galatian believers who he was instrumental in their coming to a knowledge of the saving faith of Jesus Christ. A saving faith which is by justification by faith alone. They got to a point where they added some additional nuances to the salvation by grace, which means that they would pervert the gospel. And by perverting the gospel, it is no longer the gospel. So, Paul sends them this letter to address this very subject, to reinforce that salvation is by faith alone, apart from any works of any law, which he makes clear in Galatians chapter 2, in verses 15 and 16, where it says, "We who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified." That is, no flesh shall be justified by any works of any law whatsoever. Paul here was dealing with the addition that the Galatians had begun to embrace as a result of influence by the Judaizers, who basically let the Galatians know that it is fine to embrace this justification by faith, so long as that salvation that you believe is being obtained includes a circumcision of the flesh. And it is to this where Paul needed to reply to make them understand that any addition of any law to grace is no longer grace. And if they embrace it as such, they have fallen from grace because they have frustrated the grace of God as is spelled out in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. But as we went through this passage, or the book of Galatians, we come to Galatians 5. We left off dealing with and spent several days on dealing with the issues and of defining what the works of the flesh are, that if anyone who continues to practice these works will not inherit the kingdom of God, implying that those who practice these things are not saved people. The operative word is practice. They live by these things. They live a life of apart from conviction regarding these sins, and therefore perpetuate them in their everyday life as a matter of lifestyle. Now, in chapter 5, in verse 18, Paul says, But if you be led of the Spirit, contrary to not being led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. If you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. This is a major statement, which should be a death blow to anybody who calls himself a so-called Torah keeper or a law keeper. Because by saying that you keep the law and that law keeping is necessary for your salvation, then Paul makes it very clear that if this is the case for you, then you are not being led of the Spirit. There's no possibility of being led by the Spirit and keeping the law and being justified by faith. It is one or the other. You are justified by keeping the law, or you are justified by faith. And only those who are justified by faith are able to be reconciled to God because they are led by the Spirit. And so if you're a law keeper, you are not being led of the Spirit. Paul makes that clear. So the only way around this is to either relent from the foolish idea that you can be saved by grace and through keeping the law, or you have to acknowledge that salvation for you will not come by way of grace or by faith, but that you are going to try to stand before God in your own quote unquote obedience, which I already know this is something that all who attempt to do have and will continue to fail at doing. It is an out and out impossibility. And so Christians need to understand that salvation is only by way of grace, through faith, not of yourselves, it being a gift of God. Now, to get into the text for tonight, we covered all of the works of the flesh. Paul outlines them in Galatians 5:19, where he says this: "Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery and fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness." These can be adequately categorized as sensual sins. Verse 20, he adds idolatry and witchcraft. These would be, as we said before, religious sins. And then he goes on to say hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, and heresies. In verse 21, envyings, murders, drunkenness, and revelings, and such the like. All of these can come under the category of social sins or social works of the flesh. So you have sensual sins, religious sins of the flesh, and social sins of the flesh. We've dealt with all of these at length, except for one. And I wanted to hold this one for last and for this particular session tonight. And that is when he talks about murders or slayings. And I wanted to do this for a reason, because I know that what this is, for the most part, I don't need to explain in any significant detail. We all know what it is to take another life. Maybe not by experience in a literal sense, but we know what it means in an ideological sense. We know what it means to take someone's life. However that is done, we know what that means, taking another life. So I don't think that I need to spend a whole lot of time on dealing with what that means. In these other categories, some things are worthy of explanation, but this one is one that we are all well acquainted with. well acquainted with. And so, but what I want to deal with on this subject of slaying, I'm not going to use schmurder. I can't stand that comment, that statement, but let's just refer to it as slayings, taking a man's life, something along those lines. So anyway, to slay another man. In the Old Covenant, these things were handled with swiftness. And God gave laws regarding those who intentionally took another man's life. Most of us who know the Word of God know what the penalty is under the Old Covenant, what the penalty is to take a life. In other words, if you took a life, your life was taken. If it was, like Brother Michael says, it was an eye for an eye. You take a life, your life is therefore taken from you. That was the law. That was the law. And so this is something that no one quarreled with regarding that situation. You took someone's life, you committed a capital crime. If you premeditated taking someone else's life, this was a capital offense, and it was resulting in your condemnation mortally. But now, we need to discuss another type. There's another type of slaying. And it was an accidental slaying. In our day and time, we call it manslaughter. Back then, they called it manslayer. Manslayer, manslaughter, we're talking about the same things. But the whole idea behind this from a legal standpoint is that this was an unintentional slaying. An unintentional slaying. Now, there's something unique about this particular circumstance. But before I talk about that, I want to bring something to your attention, which maybe you might not be aware of. Because there were 5 principal laws that were made by men that God never made. There were 5 principal laws that the Jews made up on their own and did not come from God. 5. Number 1 is, well, let me do this. Let me step back a little bit. I'm going to ask the panel. There are 5 laws that the Jews made up in their time that God never gave them. It didn't derive from God. They didn't get it from Moses. It wasn't ceremonial and it wasn't moral. But they were man-made, culturally developed laws. And there's 5 of them. And I want to ask the panel to try to render a guess. I will give everybody a chance to answer that, see if we can get all 5 of them before we get to the last person. So let's start with Sister Tyson. How are you tonight?
Good. You doing okay?
I'm doing all right, sister. How are you?
So no healing on the Sabbath?
Nope. That wasn't it.
No? Dang.
Nope. You want to give another try?
No, you
Now
can
keep-
go ahead.
Now keep in mind, these are laws. These are laws that God did not make up, that they made up and followed. Brother Jeff, what you got? Huh?
No, I know he said they couldn't work on the Sabbath, but I think, they transformed that on their own into you can't heal on the Sabbath. So But I could be wrong. That was just the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah, no, they didn't. They didn't make a law. Well, there was a law about not working on the Sabbath, but they took it to. They took an existing law to an extreme. So what I'm talking about is an actual law that was made by them that they observed that God did not give them. Brother Jeff, man of God, what do you think?
I got nothing. Meg's put some stuff in the comments. I don't know about that. I mean, when I think about, I don't have anything.
Brother Jeffrey, encouraging servant.
Well, I'm sitting here drawing a blank too, Jonathan. The Jews were famous for, or the Pharisees were famous for making laws that, the people couldn't follow. But like my brother Jeff above, I am kind of getting a zero here, so I'm just going to step out and let somebody else take a shot at it.
That's all right. That's all right. Brother Canaan.
Good evening, Brother Jonathan and panel. God bless everyone. And I also am not certain about this one, and so I'm excited to hear what it is because, like some people have commented before, they took things beyond what God had given them, and so I'm curious as to see what they are as well. But I genuinely don't know.
Yep. All right. That's fair. Fair enough. Sister Candy. Oh, I got the whole group stumped so far. I like this. This is kind of fun. Sister Candy, your thoughts?
Stumped.
I like it. Oh, 7 out of, or what is 5 out of 5 so far, I think. Or 6 out of 6. Sister Lisa, can you think of anything?
No, I honestly, I don't have any idea.
All right. So I'll list them for you. But I want you, there's 5, and I want you to focus on, we're going to talk about the last one. So the other ones we're not going to talk about. Number 1, the law of divorce. The law of divorce. This was something that God never gave them. He never gave them. Now, it wasn't a part of any of his laws. They were already doing this. But what God ended up doing, because of their getting out of control, and with the abuse of this whole thing, leaving their wives or their husbands for whatever reason, he allowed Moses to grant them a certificate of divorcement. But it was never a law that God made for divorce. And Christ clears this up for us later. And it's not about him supporting it. It's about him regulating it. And see, this is the problem that most people have when it comes to these kind of things. Like Brother Brian is saying, these weren't things that God supported. But he did end up coming around behind the cultural phenomena that was being introduced by the Jews, and he began to regulate it. So the law of divorce wasn't something that he invented, although he did sanction them after the fact to give a certificate of divorcement under certain conditions to regulate it so that people weren't leaving their wives or husbands for no reason. Go check it out. God never gave it as a law. Number 2, this is going to be a hot one because God never gave a law for this. However, he did introduce law to regulate it, and that is the law of slavery. The law of slavery. God never issued a law of slavery. Never. And I know that there's a lot of people, even people that look like me, that like to make this case. But God never gave law about it, and God never sanctioned it. What he did, he regulated it. He came along and he regulated. Just like he told them that you cannot teach them or treat them poorly. You cannot bring them back and abuse them. And slaves then, under God, he is the one who implemented guidelines for slaves, giving them rights. That's another subject for another day. God never instituted a law of slavery. Nowhere does he do this. Prove me wrong. Go check it out. Here's another one. Polygamy. Polygamy was rampant under the old covenant. but it wasn't part of the covenant. God never gave a law regarding polygamy. He always said marriage was between one man and one woman. And they decided to make their own law regarding marriage and had multiple wives. Today, we have people of the same sex marrying each other. Man-made. But polygamy, we see it throughout the Old Testament. Almost all of these men, many of them, David, all of them, they had multiple wives. But polygamy was never something that God authored or sanctioned. Never did. Never did. And then there was number 4, the law of oaths and vows. We learn that we are supposed to not make oaths and vows. We're admonished to not do this. And get something that came from God. But this was God never authorized or said, I need you to make vows, or you should be making vows, or you should be making oaths. To the contrary, he said to avoid it. And part of the reason for this is that you cannot be assured of accomplishing anything because providence is not in your control. Only God is sovereignly in control over providence. So now I know that many people are probably going to be thinking, I need to go check this out. And that's what this is all about. But I want to deal with the last one, number 5, because it is about this subject that we're talking about tonight. The unintentional slaying of another man. So in the old covenant, if a person accidentally slew another man, then under Jewish man-made law, a family member could go after the person who committed the slaying, even though it was unintentional, and take their life. This was sanctioned by the Jewish community. This was in their custom. This was in their culture. And this is something that they did as a matter of law under their own system. They made this law up that a family member can go and slay or be an avenger of the soul who was slain, even though it was unintentional. God never made that law. There's nothing that Moses received from God that gave them this law, that they could go do this. There was nothing. But like in all the other instances, God, dealing with wicked men who seek about to establish a law to themselves, as always, and as we even do to this very day, what God did was regulate this as well. Does anybody want to guess how he regulated the law of the avenger of blood? Anybody?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it.
All right, go ahead.
Well, they established cities of refuge, sanctuary cities. And if you felt that you were, that you had done this accidentally and that you'd be, stoned for it or whatever, then you could run for it to avoid the avenger of blood. The avenger of blood could not enter the city and kill you. And you had to stay there until the death of the current high priest.
That's right. That's exactly what happened. God instituted cities of refuge. He instituted the cities of refuge in order to deal with this, with these sprees. I wouldn't say a spree, but to thwart the ability of family members to avenge the blood of their relatives who were slain or cut down accidentally. They offered no mercy for even accidental killings. They didn't do that. But God, in his infinite wisdom, he instituted the cities of refuge. He instituted the cities of refuge, and these cities of refuge is where the manslayer would go in order to avoid being taken out himself. To give you some background, I want to turn to the book of Numbers, The book of Numbers, chapter 35. The book of Numbers 35. And hold on, let me get it up here again. So in the book of Numbers, chapter 35, I'm going to start at verse 11. Then you shall appoint cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the slayer may flee there who accidentally killed another person accidentally. They shall be unto you cities for refuge from the avenger, that the manslayer should not die until he stand before the congregation in judgment. And of these cities, which you shall give, 6 cities shall you have for refuge. You shall give 3 cities on this side of the Jordan, and 3 cities shall you give in the land of Canaan, which shall be cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall be a refuge, both for the children of Israel and for the stranger, and for the stranger, and for the sojourner among them, that everyone that kills any person unawares may flee there. Now, let me stop there for a second. Anybody want to venture a guess or want to give an application as to why it didn't just include a sanctuary city for Israel, but these cities of refuge were also for sojourners and the strangers? Anybody want to render an application for that in this context?
I'll take a go to foreshadow the one body of Christ, the application of them joining into the bond.
Okay, you're on the right track. Add a little bit more to it.
I'll let somebody else take it.
But you're right, but there's one more element that needs to be added to it to complete it. Anybody else? Because it is a foreshadowing, like Tyson said. But what else? What is it foreshadowing?
The inclusion of the Gentiles?
Yes, that's exactly right. Sojourners and strangers were Gentiles. That's what they were. And it's foreshadowing that. So, verse 16. And if he smite him with an instrument of iron so that he die, he is a murderer. And then he goes on and he lists different things that a person can do that intentionally take somebody's life. Okay? But then he goes on and he comes down to verse 28. I'm going to skip a lot of this. In verse 28, he says, in verse 27, the revenger of blood find him without borders of the city, of his refuge, and the avenger of blood kill the slayer. He shall not be guilty of blood, but he should have remained in the city of his refuge until the death of the high priest. But after the death of the high priest, the slayer shall return to the land of his possession. So here's where we're going to go. I'm going to try to paraphrase instead of reading the whole chapter. So here's the thing. There was no law to protect those who committed manslaughter. And the Jews of the Old Covenant, they manufactured their own law, allowing any family member to slay anyone who took the life of one of their relatives, even though it was unintentional. It wasn't on purpose or premeditated. So God gave them 6 cities of refuge. And these 6 cities of refuge were instituted by God in order to preserve life and to prevent what is it when you don't give justice? What's the expression? In other words, to make sure that a person actually received justice. And in that time, it was the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth situation. You cannot have somebody taking another person's life for taking another life that they didn't intend to take. It was an accident. If an axe handle flies off and hits a guy in the head and he dies, this was an accident. This wasn't intentional. So six refuge cities were set up so that the man who did this act of manslaughter could flee. he could flee there. Now, there were several things that we need to consider when it came to this whole thing. So when these people did this, it was necessary for them to go immediately. It was necessary for them to go immediately. Now, when these were made, they were made with a specific design and purpose. Does anybody have an idea what the specific design and purpose was for these cities of refuge and for getting there? Anybody have an idea? Anybody? I'll even take an idea. Nope. All right.
Ask your question again. Restate
Go
your
ahead, Candy. Go
question.
ahead.
Well, restate your question first.
So, if a person committed this act, they knew they were in trouble. And they also knew that a family member would be coming after them. So, the cities of refuge were set up a certain way on purpose. What way were they set up? How were they set up?
I don't know. Go ahead, tell me, because I was thinking it
No,
was
well,
more
I'll
like
jump
kind
in
of
here. I think they were placed.
foreshadowing again.
I'm just going to take a wild-eyed guess. I think they were placed equidistant in the land so that no place was too far from anybody who might commit such an act.
That's one. Anything
Geographic.
else? Anything else? Close proximity. That's one.
Yeah,
What else? Anything else? Anybody? Here's one thing. So they had to be geographically close. So that's absolutely correct. Here's the other thing. They had to have really good accessibility. Accessibility. And so they were spread out so that there was one always close. But they had to make sure that the pathway to get there was clear. The pathway to get there was clear. You guys may remember last week when we talked about Isaiah 40 verse 4, where Isaiah says, every valley shall be exalted. Every mountain and hill shall be made low. And the crooked paths shall be made straight. And the rough places shall be made plain. Do we remember what that meant? Anybody?
Yeah, I was
The,
making it.
val-
Go
the
ahead, Lisa.
valleys were, oh, sorry, Jeff. The valleys were those poor in spirit, and the Lord would raise them up. And those on the mountain, those were the prideful. They will be brought low. So we were
Okay.
all on equal footing, straight. The crooked paths would be made straight.
Right? And the rough places plain. So that means that the road would be smoothed out, and the road would be straightened, and the road would be made level, so that the pathway is clear to the Lord ultimately, which is what we're talking about. So here, when we talk about the roads to the city of refuge, to the cities of refuge, we're talking about the same exact thing. The same thing. The road has to be clear. So when we talk about accessibility and nearness, let's take nearness for example. How is nearness relevant to our understanding about our salvation now? Nearness to the city of refuge. Anybody? What significance does